I am going to be talking about SVG and GreenSock for complex animation. I'm really excited about being here because I get to talk about the thing that I love the most in the world to a bunch of people. That is pretty great. There's my Twitter and CodePen, but if you guys want to see that later, I can show it on the last slide. Yeah, like I said, I'm a senior UX engineer at Twitter, or at, not just Twitter, at Trulia. So today we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to be doing stuff that's a little bit more like, a JavaScript party. We're going to make a party, or we'll have, an event coordinator, like a JavaScript event coordinator to help us with that party. If you don't like these kind of bad pun jokes, I'm sorry, they're going to happen a lot. One of the things that's great about all of this stuff is there's tons of stuff that we can do and use, and a lot is available to us already. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the stuff that you can use today on websites. So why? Why are we animating things to begin with? Animation kind of gets a bad rap sometimes. Animation is pretty powerful to convey meaning, and that's part of the reason why it has a bad rap, because anything that's moving grabs your attention the most. Everybody kind of knows that like a big red button will make you want to click it, and it drives leads for our site. But nothing, your brain is completely trained to watch anything in movement because of our biology and because of evolution. So animation, when done poorly, is really, really bad and irritating. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the refinement of this animation. It can also guide your users. So if you're showing people where to go or what to do on a site, animation can be really powerful as a tool. And also because otherwise we're not using the web to its full potential. The web is an amazing place. I, love the internet. And otherwise it's kind of a static, droll box. There's so much we can do. There's so many opportunities here. And it's also fun. SVG, for those of you who are still kind of concerned with SVG, let's kind of go over some basics before we go on. SVG is crisp on any display. It's resolution independent. In our days of multiplying all of these devices with all of their different screen resolutions, not having to replace an image for your different screen resolutions is a huge boon. There's less HTTP requests to handle. This is probably going to be less of a deal as HTTP 2 comes into play, but as we're not there yet, we're still kind of dealing with those requests, aren't we? So it's really easily scalable for responsive. I mean, it's in the name, scalable vector graphics. This is what it was built to do. This is what it was meant to do. So let's use it to its full potential. It's a really small file size if you design for performance. And the key takeaway in this sentence is actually if you design for performance. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm also going to show you like exactly how small some things can be. You might be surprised. It's really easy to animate. One of the things that I love about SVG is that it has a navigable DOM, so you can reach in there, you can grab things, you can move them around. It's very intuitive if you've been using HTML and CSS for your whole life. And one of the really great things about it is, like, unlike with Canvas, if it breaks down, there's still something there to debug. So that's kind of nice for those kind of workflows. It's really easy to make accessible. Because of the navigable DOM, you can easily put title and ARIA tags in there and actually make it accessible for screen readers and blind people, even if it is a complex animation. And it's fun. For those of you who think that SVG has poor support, look at all that green. This is definitely a technology that you can use now. You should definitely be checking your analytics, but I'll show you some ways to like make fallbacks and things like that, but you might not need them as much as you think that you do. So there's an incredible lot we can do with just storytelling within an SVG. So there's a lot we can do in terms of telling a story, in terms of showing things, in terms of making complex animations. Before we get started, though, before we kind of get into like the cool JavaScript-y parts, we should talk about some like responsible things to do. One of them is optimizing. SVGO is a really, really great tool, and there's actually a web-based GUI that Jake Archibald made called SVG-OMG. If I give you the slide link later, you can just go and click all of these links. They're active. So it gives a lot of toggles. So you really do need to like kind of refine it. I don't suggest ever optimizing an SVG without looking at the output. You need a GUI for this, because the way that you optimize it actually does change its appearance and can actually destroy it. So it's really important that you're actually looking and seeing what the output is as you're working with it. It doesn't mean you can't use a terminal-based tool like SVGO, and there is an SVGO GUI that you can also get on GitHub. These are 2 GitHub links at the bottom. And then there's Peter Collinridge's SVG editor. It's kind of like old school, like really, really old school. I still like it. It also has an editing tab, so you can edit it live. That's very experimental, but it's kind of fun to play with. So yeah, check these tools out for sure. Before we get started, animation performance. We're going to talk a lot about responsive today because it's a scalable graphic. We can actually make complex animations that are responsive. That's super cool. One weird thing that, like, as a developer doesn't make sense is that people actually expect mobile to be faster than web. They think about it as like a tiny little website on their phone, so it's going to be faster. But if you're a web developer, you know that that's kind of the opposite, right? We're loading a ton of data through a less secure and less fast connection. It's not going to be as fast. So we have to kind of preemptive strike against those kind of troubles. Another good resource for animation performance, not necessarily responsive, is jankfree.org. Paul Lewis and Paul Irish from Chrome DevTools made this website. All the good Pauls work on this site. So they kind of uncover and go through like timeline recordings and ways that you can make your animations like visibly clearer and cleaner. When we talk about jank, we're talking about that stutter that you get sometimes when there's a lot of repaints. So they kind of go through some of that. Just off the bat, what I can tell you right now is moving things with transforms and opacity is really going to help you. That's really going to be a very performant way of working. SVG is not able to be hardware accelerated. That doesn't mean that it can't be performant, though, especially if you use opacity and transform. And you might think, like, oh, that's 2 properties. Like, that's not a lot. Almost every single pen I'm going to show you today only uses those 2. Transforms can do a ton of things. So don't feel like you're, in the dregs because you're using those 2 properties. If you're kind of like a performance nerd like me and you want to see some cool performance-y things, Paul Irish also did this advanced performance audit tools with DevTools where he climbs into the timeline and sees all of that working. It's kind of good to see how he's doing that so that you can debug for yourself. And I wrote a CSS Tricks article. Oh, I work on staff at CSS Tricks. I wrote a CSS Tricks article called Weighing SVG Animation Techniques with Benchmarks. So I did timeline benchmarks as well as visual benchmarks. And a few good things that I found out was that GreenSock actually performed really well. It performed as good as native technologies. I'm going to say that again because it bears repeating. It performed as well as native technologies. That's a really good library. I also did a lot of testing with Smile and CSS and Velocity. You can look at the article, but one thing that I will say about this article is that it was written at a certain time. It was written a year ago, and a lot of things have changed since then. So like GSAP is updated, and CSS actually is reporting differently in Chrome. So even that's not stable. So I think really you should test things for yourself. Find out for yourself how things work. Find out for yourself what is going to be working for what kind of animation that you're doing and how it affects your build. I also suggest, like, if you've worked with CSS animation before, write it in CSS and then write it in JavaScript and make the comparison for yourself. How is your workflow affected? How is the performance affected? I'm going to talk a little bit about a CSS to GreenSock comparison a little bit later on, and we'll go into more depth on that. So fallbacks. You might not need them, but fallbacks can happen with Modernizer. It kind of provides a body class hook that you can hook into and have a fallback to a PNG or an equivalent. Sarah Soidan has a great article about using the picture element with a polyfill as a fallback. I would say that that's very verbose. So only do that if you really, really need that backwards compatible support. Recommended, look at your analytics. Find out who's looking at your site on what browser before you spend all of that time cutting all of those picture images. One of the main principles, now we're going to dive more into how to make the stuff, now that we've been responsible. One of the main principles is design everything first and slowly unveil things. If you're working with a designer, this is something that you can ask them to do for you. So if we're looking at, I made a kind of Easter egg for CSS tricks. So like it morphs into, that was Chris Coyer's idea, the Z thing. So it does all of these like kind of nerdy, tech things, like the T turns into a fork, and there's like a link, and the star is actually our logo, so it has like a Saturn that turns into a bracket, and code, yada yada. But if we look at this and how I actually designed it before I started building stuff, it actually is just a jumble of things. I'm just making one thing go into another and like slowly revealing things and animating them on the page. I'm not showing everything at first and then bringing them out. So that's one way that you can get going really easily. Ugly storyboards totally save you time. The B is not included in this. The CSS Tricks logo thing, I spent like 2 minutes doodling this out, and then I knew where I was going with everything. Same with, these terrible, terrible thumbnails. I don't even remember which animation this is for anymore. It's so bad. But it helped me understand where I was going and what I was doing, and it saved me a lot of time. I think one of the misconceptions with storyboards is that they have to be beautiful. I feel like when I look at other people's storyboards, I'm like, I'm not going to draw a full comic and then animate. Like that's just not going to happen. So I just wanted to dispel the myth that they have to be good looking, just as long as you're communicating with yourself. There are a lot of ways of working with SVG and GreenSock that are like more UI component things, but we're not going to talk about those too much today. We're going to delve more into like a standalone graphic as an illustration because the title is complex. Like we're not just moving something from here to here. We're going to try to like dig in there and get super complex. So we've got a view box shift with a sprite. So for this pen, we've got this kind of Book of Kells illustration, and it goes across like this, and then it changes as that comes forward. So you can see that that all moves. Right. This whole SVG and animation and everything was 8 kilobytes gzipped. That's it. If you compare that to having an article that has like a picture and text, that's pretty amazing. So not only do you have something that's kind of engaging for the user, you're like saving tons of bytes just by not like slapping an image in there. So in order to make this, I did make a sprite. I made an SVG sprite. So kind of in the same way that we're saying like show parts of things, we're actually just going to use the view box. The view box being like, in an SVG, you can have a ton of space, but the view box is actually going to be the window in which you're looking at the SVG. So we can easily just shift that attribute with JavaScript and move the whole view box down from one view to another. I originally designed it with the one on the right, but then in order to reduce repetition, I just used 2 and kind of collapsed it and put classes on that I'm using media queries to kind of show and get rid of. So view box shift with JavaScript, this is kind of what we were talking about before. You're really just setting the attribute that's differently for the view box. That's all you're doing. You're listening for that change, and then you're just setting the view box, and that's how you can easily make an SVG sprite. But I did say complex, and that's not totally complex, is it? So if we want to do really complex stuff, we're definitely going to use some GSAP. I think it's important to say that I don't work for them. They don't pay me. I'm not like a marketing ploy or anything. I'm just a developer that found a tool that I really like. So yeah, just to put that out there. It solves a lot of cross-browser inconsistencies. One of the kind of big gripes that people have about working with SVG, especially in animation where things are moving around, is that there are some really weird browser inconsistencies across versions. And GSAP solves a lot of these things for you. I don't write browser hacks anymore because I use GSAP. That's pretty incredible. This bug in Firefox has been fixed just recently. But look at how bad that is. I mean, there's other ones that are like this. Like marrying it with opacity also does something like this. Like there's tons of like little headaches, especially as you start to work with responsive, that can drive you absolutely batty. And sometimes just working with GSAP to not have to deal with these, especially on mobile, is just, it's awesome. There's other browser transform origin issues. So one of the things in the SVG spec that just kind of doesn't make any sense is that when you have layers of these transform origins, if you keep switching transform origins, the way that it actually materializes doesn't, it like makes sense on paper, but doesn't make sense when you look at it. So if we're watching, the one on the right is actually like based on the spec, and you can see it flipping around and just like jumping to that readjustment. GSAP actually has this feature called smooth origin, and it's the default. So you don't have to do anything. GSAP has already like got your back if you want to switch the transform origin for some attribute. Timeline. So timeline is probably also like along with the browser inconsistency, timeline is like probably the biggest reason I use GSAP, and here's why. You can stack tweens, so rather than in CSS, you would have to like put a delay on each one. You just stack them and they already immediately follow each other. You can set them a little bit before and after each other, so like you can set them at the same time, or like say like, oh, just 1 second into that last one, do this thing. And I'll show you how that's done in a second. You can change their placement in time. I'll also show you that. You can group them into scenes. You can add relative labels. These are more things towards keeping your code organized and easy to follow. You can add relative labels, so like if you need 17 things to happen all at the same time, it's very easy to do so. I'll show you examples of that code. And you can animate your animations. So you can make the whole thing faster, move the placement of the whole scene, you can nest, all without recalculation. So what do I mean about recalculation? If you are making a complex animation in CSS and you have many, many animations and you have delays between all of them, and say you need something to fire at the same time as something else, and for one of them it's at the 66% keyframe, and for the other one it's at a different keyframe and they're firing exactly at the same time. If someone comes in and makes you adjust the animation before one of those things, you then have to go back and recalculate all of those percentages based on that. And I've never, ever made a complex animation where I didn't adjust the timing. So this ends up being a really big deal for your workflow. So in this pen, I have this like initial kind of like animation that's going on, and you can see things that are firing at the same time. So we're going to look a little more closely at that. That first one fires a few times in that animation. So that's where it is on the timeline. The second part fires here. Probably don't need to narrate the rest. You can look at the screen. So I can adjust the timing of these animations if they're grouped into functions, right? I can just switch them and have the whole thing go in a different order. I can also just make the whole thing faster in one line of code. So let's say you get to the end of making this like really complex animation and you're like, it's just like a little too slow. Your eye does pick up on those minute movements. This is a huge boon. And the other thing about this is it's not just for like making something a little bit faster and slower, if you need to debug the timing of animations, being able to set in one line of code, okay, go at a snail's pace so I can really see what's going on, that's super helpful for debugging. So other cool things for complex animation. Motion along a path. Motion along a path is moving into CSS. It is also moving out of Smile. Smile is getting deprecated. And IE is still not, like, our Edge is still not sure that they're going to support it. You can go vote to support it, and you should. So right now, it doesn't have very good support in anything other than GSAP. And this has the longest tail of support. This goes all the way back to IE9. So it will soon be in our CSS spec and supported by browsers. But in the meantime, if you need a lot of support for things like motion along a path, which is important for realism, and we're going to go into that a little bit more, that's the widest support. There's draggable, so you might have seen, like in that first animation, how I'm twisting a knob in order to get things to happen. That's part of draggable. You can drag and drop objects. You can tween CSS properties, which means you can make things look like they're coming through space, right? Because you can tween perspective, you can tween z-index, all of those kind of things. Draw SVG, that's like when you make, you've seen like the Nintendos that draw themselves. We're going to do a few fun things with those later. You can, of course, do that in regular CSS by kind of like animating that path value, but in GSAP you can just set 0 to true, or 20% to 50%, and it figures out that stuff for you. It's very, very easy to work with. It's also Morph SVG is probably the thing that hits GreenSock out of the park. So that first CSS tricks demo where everything's changing into each other. GreenSock is the only animation API that can tween things that have different path amounts. So even Smile, even Snap SVG needs the same amount of paths in order to tween, and you don't have a lot of finite control. And I'll show you how to get finite control in GSAP. There's also relative color tweening, so you don't have to like find every value for something. You can tween it relative to where it already is. There's also cycle stagger, so you can have things stagger, but do 2 different values or 3. So this is probably hard to see on the screen, but this is my GreenSock teaching monster. So we're going to build a really simple tween and then make it more complex. So simple tween. We've got the eye, and he just blinks. And then we've got 2 tweens. Got the antenna, we're adding the antenna. So these tweens fire at the same time. So you have the antenna and the eye at the same time. A simple timeline. So now that we have one thing, and then the next thing follows it in a timeline. Now I'm going to make a master timeline. So we have the function for that, and it's just adding to that. So we're just adding it to master. So this helps us to add another function, which is the wing flap. And we just add it to the bottom of master. So that's kind of like the basics of what you need to know in order to get going with tweens and timelines. So relative color tweening, let's dig into all of the things I just said. Relative color tweening is like, you can adjust the hue based on what you're doing. You can adjust the saturation. You can adjust the brightness. So, I can keep playing with these turtles because I like their little tail movements. Is it weird that I made something that I like playing with? We can also use that to make like whole scenes. This is a city construction site, get it, website. And we're going to make this whole thing come on. So we can drag it on. And then we can also like adjust the hue and saturation values, and I made them slightly different so you can kind of get a different effect every time you play with this. And then, this is the perspective, those things change, or we can just have the whole thing draw on by itself. But these are all like cool things you can let the users control too. So if we look at the code for that, it's pretty simple. I'm only showing you, well, it looks more simple here because I'm only showing you one small part. But we've got a relative, we've got a kind of standard color value here, right? You see the var ch2 is HSL, and then we have the relative color values. The reason why I made it a variable is because the background needs background. Like, it's not going to use the same thing as the SVG, which is using fill. So I just want them to be consistent. And then for the other things, we have paused equals true for the timeline, which means it's paused initially so that I can call it later in a function. So if there's an event handler on a button or something, then I can restart that timeline that way. So motion along a path for realism. I was going to animate some fireflies, and fireflies have like really interesting movement. I feel like being an animator makes me watch things a lot more. Like I'm always like, what does water do when it comes out of a faucet? So fireflies have this like weird way of jumping around and stuff. So this is my like steampunk lighting. So we were talking about motion along a path. It's actually really easy to tween motion along a path values. It's just an array of x, y coordinates that you can see in these values here. We have auto rotate true, and I'll show you what that does with a particular demo, and type equals soft. There's a few different ways we can work with the type as well. So there's a curviness value that we can use. Soft is one, or I can set it to a numerical value. So we have Bezier tween with curviness set to 0 does like pretty much nothing. It just like keeps it as you would think. It just goes from one value to another one. And the curviness set to 4 starts to kind of unravel on itself, but the curviness set to 2 is probably as close as you're going to get to like a loop around. Basically, you can think about it like this. You have an xy coordinate, you have an xy coordinate, you have an xy coordinate, and there's like a rubber band between these two. So the rubber band is taut at 0, and then as it goes to 2, it gets kind of like loose, and then as we get to 4, it kind of like unravels around. So if we go all the way to 8, it's going to be like, there's 0, blah, blah. Which might be useful for some types of motion. I wrote a David Walsh blog article about this. It's actually a series about GSAP and SVG. So if you are more interested in getting into the nitty-gritty details of the code, you can check that out too. Auto rotate. So you see that little weird guy. I don't even know what he is. I'm just making things. So if I set it to false, he doesn't follow the path, right? This is just kind of like if you were tweening motion along a path with some other technology, that's what you might expect to happen. But with auto rotate true, he's actually like moving along with that line. So scalable graphics, scalable animation, let's do some fun responsive stuff. One thing that's really cool that's not supported anywhere else, and of course GreenSock does really well, is percentage-based transforms on SVG. That's pretty exciting. But more exciting than that is you might not need it. So we've got this animation that's like fully responsive and scalable in every direction. I'm going to let it play out first, and then I'll show you what that does. So if I replay, I can kind of click to randomly resize, and the animation stays stable no matter what I do. So that's pretty cool. And it doesn't necessarily have to be fluid either. Like, there's very few times on a website that you're going to make an animation or a graphic where you're just going to make it go like this and squish. So let's actually do some real responsive design and development. So designing interactions in responsive animations. Now we're going to get some like really fun, complex stuff. When I designed it, and if you're working with another designer, you can kind of talk about this with them. Basically, I made it like Legos. Every area that I'm using inside this graphic has kind of like a basic format. So if you can see, like the desktop version is the same as this version, but I flipped the magenta box and stacked it, and I made sure that they had interlocking parts. The other part that you do is like each one of these boxes is actually a function, and each function calls a different timeline. That way I know exactly where to go for both design and development. My code is really organized. It's super easy to adjust and manipulate. So if we look at this pen, This is a Huggy Laser Panda factory. We, click here and he gets a chip put in his head and turns into a laser guy. We click here and he gets painted like a panda. And we click here and he gets like, Huggy. And then, and then as I scale it down, you can see it just like interlock like that. And it still works. And we're just got basically those functions are working in the same way that you'd think that they would on desktop. So one of the things I have, you might have seen that like repeated animation that's going on for everything. We've got like the little bubbles that are coming out of the top, and that just keeps going. So we have like repeat -1, which just allows everything to loop. So I have one function that's all the looping things, and that is just set to keep on repeating itself. We've got other functions like this paint panda. I'm just showing you a little bits of the code, so if it looks kind of confusing to see parts of it, all of my demos are on CodePen, and you can just totally, scroll through them, yell at me about stuff. There's a, comment box. So I have it paused initially, and then I'm triggering it after. So anytime you're clicking on that, it's triggering the restart. We're going to deal with other complex, this is more like theory of animation, so atmosphere. One of the things I was thinking about when I was I started trying to animate elements like fire and smoke and stuff. And so one of the things I was finding when I was trying to make those things work is it's kind of hard to make those things work if you're just looking at it straight. So here's an example that is neither SVG nor JavaScript, but in this pen, what's important here is that the atmosphere is actually like the character. The atmosphere is the most important part. So elemental motion, things that are further away have less contrast and are blurry. Things that, you have to think about whether or not the air or environment affects movement. Reducing precision allows for understanding. So if I look at smoke like this, and I reduce the precision of it, I can actually see that there are circles inside that smoke. And the way that the air is hitting them, I can actually then I can start to grok how I'm going to animate that. So putting techniques together. Morph SVG, so that's something that we were talking about before. You point from one ID to another. And we're going to use shape index. So this is a really cool thing. Remember I said finite control? You can load this and get this GUI, and you can actually change the way that it morphs by picking a different value for where those morphing kind of points are laying. And so then I can make things like smoke and fire. So how did I make this? A couple of the things that I'm animating are the kind of flame here. I made them blue so that you can see all of the different ones, and then I just copy them and make them bigger for the kind of red values. I just drew all of this stuff in Illustrator, and I have little pieces that are coming up here. But I'm also using this goo filter. I don't know if any of you have seen Lucas Beber's kind of famous. He used the SVG filter to make this goo. So I'm actually animating the filter. Anything that's an integer, I can animate with GreenSock. So that's pretty cool. I can reach right in there and make the filter become more and less gooey through the flame, because the flame doesn't stay consistent at all. I can also kind of, if I name everything properly, I can just set a for loop to go through all of these different values and these different IDs and kind of set it with that, label, the, relative timeline. I can just add it incrementally to the timeline, so it's always kind of firing. It's always morphing at that next piece. So there's more than one way of working. Blake Bowen is really great. He made this kind of way to work with GSAP with a Catmull ROM spleen. I could have also done it this way. So if we're looking at, there's an article about the history in computer science. I'm actually almost out of time, so I'm not going to talk about this too much, but you can look at it further. And then you can set different points in these polylines. And it's basically, again, like that rubber band we were talking about. It's making it a little bit more curvy between these points. So I could have just adjusted the point values between these things. I didn't have to draw out every flame in Illustrator. So I also made things like smoke. So that's also done with kind of like a for loop with these values. So like morph SVG just goes through here, and I needed a slightly different for loop for the timing, so I just add a relative label, and it adds incrementally to that. Design and information and animation, I have like not a lot of time, but I'm going to try to power through this last part really quickly. Infographics have died. Infographics used to have a ton of conversion. You can see like in this tiny little thing that with a traditional post got 243 actions, 1,000 for things that had infographics. I wrote an article about this if you want to learn more. There's lots of different blogs with tons of, addressing how much leads were affected. There's tons of conversion and increased traffic to their website, lead increase, number of new visitors to the site went up. But all of these posts are older than 2 years, and you really don't see infographics anymore at all. What happened? I really think that the big problem here is that it's not responsive. Infographics on desktop are like this cool thing that you get to explore, and on mobile are kind of this horrible pinch and grab affair. There was a tipping point 2 years ago where mobile kind of took over desktop, and so I think that for social media in particular, this just wasn't viable anymore. And the design was also not updated to the current context. So if we have this pen, we have this responsive animated infographic, and it kind of goes through all of these global warming values, but then it also works for mobile. And you have a lot of information in just like a small area rather than having to look all over the place for all of this different stuff. So change the view box like we did before. We're just changing the view box from one view to another. And we do media queries for layout and fallback with Modernizer. We can actually make it very easily accessible by adding an ARIA labeled by and a title. Dudley Story wrote a really great article on how to do so. This is like the last fun thing that we'll do before ending. It's just a little bit of interaction in animation. So I can add interaction to my SVG. So if you see this balloon, SVG was kind of built for these things. So if I look at it, really I'm just grabbing the radius, and the CY for that attribute is just like where that circle is placed, and I'm just updating the radius and the CY value through every time that that's hit. And then you can see that like I start a timeline upon like basically once it gets to a certain, big largeness, I don't know, then I activate a timeline especially for that. And then I attach it to like a key event. Social coding sites help you learn. I love CodePen. I'm like a huge fan of them. They also don't pay me. I made like a CodePen propaganda poster because I'm a giant nerd and this is what I do. But basically, it's just like one of my favorite places to be because I learn a ton. I can easily see what other people are doing and learn from them. They can engage with stuff that I'm doing. We can learn from each other. I think it's a great community. Nothing but good people on there. JS Fiddle is great. Dablet is great. Any time that people are showing examples with their code that they're kind of like allowing you to play with so that you can manipulate it and see what actually happens for yourself. I'm not the kind of person who reads a technical manual like an SVG spec and understands how an SVG works without moving it around and playing with it and bumping into the problems. So for people like, if you're anything like me, then CodePen is a really great place to work. There's some people you should know about. Again, these are in my slides, so I'm not going to leave this up for too much longer, but you can check them all out later. You should follow them on Twitter, follow them on CodePen. They're super awesome. I have a front-end master's course coming out in February, so if you're in front-end masters, you can check that out. Advanced SVG animation goes into like some of the stuff we talked about today, but in much more detail. This is not the cover of my new O'Reilly book. My friend was trolling me. That's not my last name. But I will have an O'Reilly book coming out in pre-release in the next couple of months. And thank you. It was really a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thanks.